Well, after Tulsa, people liked to believe America had learned its lesson. But just 2 years later, an entire town in Florida was wiped off the map, and no one was ever charged. Last week, we talked about the Greenwood District in Tulsa, reduced to ash in one of the deadliest racial massacres in American history. In the aftermath, the country told itself it would never happen again. That promise didn't even last 2 years. This month, during Black History Month, we're examining a pattern America has spent generations trying not to be honest about. A pattern of communities being punished for prosperity, children being murdered for existing, and leaders being eliminated for challenging power. Tulsa wasn't the end, but it was a warning. In January of 1923, a place called Rosewood, Florida, history repeated itself very quietly, efficiently, and with almost no resistance from the people who were supposed to stop it. No planes this time, no national headlines, just armed men, whispered accusations, and a community that dared to exist independently in the Jim Crow South. All it took was one accusation, one woman's claim, one rumor repeated until it turned into justification, and within days, Rosewood was surrounded, burned, and erased. Families fled into swamps. Bodies were left behind. Homes and churches torched. And when it was all over, the state of Florida shrugged. No arrests, no trials, no justice. For decades, Rosewood was treated like a ghost story, something half remembered, inconvenient, and easier to ignore. Survivors were told to stay quiet, to be grateful that they had lived, to forget. But this month, during Black History Month, forgetting is not an option. Because Rosewood is not an isolated tragedy. It's part of a pattern that also includes Tulsa, that includes Elaine, Arkansas, that includes Birmingham, Alabama, that includes the names we know and the ones we don't. Violence against Black Americans has never been accidental, and it has never been rare. It's simply been ignored when it was politically convenient to do so. So this episode is about Rosewood, but it's also about what America does after the smoke clears. Who gets remembered, who gets erased, and how long the truth can be buried before it forces its way to the surface. In the early 1920s, Rosewood, Florida was a small but remarkably stable Black community tucked into Levy County along the Gulf Coast. It was the kind of place that rarely survived under Jim Crow segregation, a town where Black families owned their land outright, built homes that stayed in the family for generations, operated businesses, attended church weekly, and sent their children to school without relying on any oversight. Rosewood had its own post office, multiple churches, a schoolhouse, and skilled tradespeople, carpenters, teachers, and farmers who were providing for people within the community. While life was far from free of racism, Rosewood represented something close to autonomy, and that alone made it very unusual in the deep south of America. Just a few miles away sat the town of Sumner, predominantly white and economically dependent on the turpentine industry. Many residents worked there, tapping pine trees or serving white households, but those same residents, Black residents, lived in Rosewood, and they would return every night to the community that they controlled. And that separation really mattered. See, in Sumner, power belonged to the white landowners and mill operators. In Rosewood, Black families could exercise a degree of independence that frankly unsettled their white neighbors. Prosperity in Rosewood didn't look very extravagant. It wasn't like Tulsa. There weren't wealthy Black people here, but it was still visible. And in the racially charged atmosphere of the early 20th century, visibility was still very dangerous. Florida at the time was steeped in racial violence. Lynchings were common. Law enforcement routinely sided with white mobs, and the Ku Klux Klan had reemerged as a powerful force, holding public rallies and exerting political influence across the state. A Black man did not need to be guilty of anything in order to be punished. Often, the accusation was enough. Particularly explosive were any allegations involving white women, whose supposed purity was treated as something to be violently defended, regardless of whether there was truth or any evidence. It was within this volatile environment that Rosewood existed, quietly, precariously, and always one rumor away from catastrophe. But that rumor would come on January 1st, 1923. On New Year's Day, in the nearby town of Sumner, 22-year-old Fannie Taylor, a white woman, was heard screaming inside her home. Neighbors rushed over to find her, visibly shaking and bruised. Taylor told them a black man had entered her house and assaulted her before fleeing. When she spoke to Sheriff Robert Elias Walker, she stated that she had not been sexually assaulted and she could not identify a suspect by name. But in the Jim Crow South, those details didn't matter. That accusation was enough, and word began to spread quickly. And as it spread, it changed. What Taylor initially described as a simple assault, maybe even a robbery, suddenly became more violent, more sexual, and more angering. The story passed from neighbor to neighbor, from Sumner into other counties, growing more dangerous with every repetition. The facts were just being replaced by assumptions, and the fear was turning into fury. Among Black residents, a different explanation circulated, one that never really made it into official records. Some said that Taylor had been beaten by a white lover and she blamed a Black man to cover up the affair to avoid her husband's wrath. This version of events wasn't even investigated by the police. They made no attempt to corroborate Taylor's injuries or scrutinize her account. They never searched for evidence. No questions about the inconsistencies with her statements. Law enforcement didn't even ask whether the accusation was true. They just only asked how quickly they could respond to it. And Taylor's husband, James, he wasted no time. Enraged and humiliated, he started organizing a posse almost immediately. They were armed, and all the men from Sumner joined him. Word went out to all the neighboring counties. There was a call for help that reached the members of the KKK, who were known to be very active here and eager for any excuse to assert violence. What began as a handful of men quickly smelled into a mob, fueled by alcohol, rumors, and a shared belief that this violence was not only justified, but it was necessary. And as that posse formed, authorities announced that a Black man named Jesse Hunter had recently escaped from a chain gang. Without evidence, he was immediately linked to Taylor's accusation. Hunter became the face of the alleged crime. Despite no proof, he had even been near Taylor's home. Armed men began searching the woods and swamps surrounding Rosewood, convinced that they were going to find their target. But as hours passed and Jesse Hunter was not found, suspicion shifted. Attention turned toward Rosewood itself. A town full of Black families who owned property, lived independently, and now they were hiding a fugitive. To the men gathering with guns and torches, Rosewood stopped just being a place, and it was now a problem. By nightfall, the mob was no longer just searching. They were ready to enact their punishment. As the mob fanned out through the pine forest surrounding Sumner and Rosewood, they were initially united by a single goal: find the Black man they believed assaulted Fannie Taylor. But the problem was simple and fatal. They didn't exactly know who they were looking for. Taylor had never actually named anyone, and there was no evidence to produce a real identity for someone who hurt her. In that vacuum, steeped in rumors, fear, and law enforcement itself not being helpful, the authorities announced that a Black man named Jesse Hunter had escaped and he was hiding in the area. All they had to do at that point was just make the logical leap. Hunter was labeled a suspect. Despite there being no proof, he was even still in the Sumner area. In the minds, however, of the armed men roaming the countryside, the accusation from the government was enough. Hunter was a great excuse. Search parties combed the woods, swamps, dirt roads. They would interrogate any Black laborers they came across at gunpoint, and they started dragging men out of their homes to talk to them. Shots would be fired into the trees to make someone who might be hiding run out. They brought in dogs to track scent, even though they didn't have the scent of the person they were looking for. This hunt took on the tone of a manhunt that was not sanctioned by law, but it was definitely encouraged by it. Sheriff Robert Elias Walker did absolutely nothing to restrain these people, and his deputies often walked along with them, blurring any distinction between law enforcement and vigilante justice. The message was clear: violence is acceptable. As the hours turned into days and Jesse Hunter just wasn't found, frustration began to set in, and it started to harden into something more dangerous. The mob's failure was not reframed due to a lack of evidence, but as proof of a conspiracy. And these men began insisting that the residents of Rosewood must be hiding Hunter and shielding him out of racial loyalty. That assumption, rooted in white supremacist thinking, shifted the focus of the violence from a single suspect to the entire community. And now Rosewood itself was the target. And the first attacks, they were swift and deliberate. Armed men surrounded the town, cutting off all escape routes and firing into homes, forcing the residents out onto the street. And then, once people were out of the residences, they began torching them one by one, starting with the homes on the outskirt and moving inward. Then, churches, which served as both spiritual centers and meeting places, were burned to the ground. Families fled with whatever they could carry, many of them leaving behind their land and possessions that they had accumulated over generations. Some people hid in the nearby swamps, wading into waist-deep water to avoid detection, while other people crawled through dense underbrush, remaining silent as gunshots echoed through the trees. For the people who stayed behind, though, the danger was immediate. Survivors later recalled hearing the mob shout threats and racial slurs as they advanced, taunting them before setting fire or opening fire. In some cases, Black men were pulled from their homes and shot immediately. Bodies left where they fell, unburied, unmourned, a deliberate act meant to terrorize anyone who stayed. The destruction wasn't chaotic, but very systemic. Rosewood was being erased. As the attacks intensified, a small number of Black residents armed themselves in an attempt to defend their families and their homes. They weren't trying to create a rebellion or an uprising, but this was just an act of survival. The most significant resistance occurred at the home of Sarah Carrier, where several people, many of whom were women and children, they had taken shelter. When white attackers approached the house, gunfire erupted. 2 white men were killed, including C.P. Wilkerson, also known as Polly. He was a deputy sheriff. This was a very big deal. These deaths became the rallying cry for the mob. The narrative shifted instantly, and the next day the newspapers came out with the most horrible headlines: Negro insurrection, portraying Rosewood's residents not as victims, but as aggressors of the entire thing. The fact that Black residents had fired back in defense of their lives was used to justify an even more violent response. The deaths of the 2 white men were cited repeatedly as proof that the town needed to be destroyed. Any remaining restraint vanished. What followed was an escalation in both scale and cruelty. Armed groups returned to Rosewood again and again over the course of the week, burning any structure that had been missed, hunting for anyone who had not yet escaped. Survivors described being chased through the woods, shot at while fleeing, forced to hide for days without food or water, children warned not to cry, families huddled together in silence as gunfire and flames lit up the sky. Accounts from survivors also described acts of extreme violence that were not investigated. At least one Black woman was captured and sexually assaulted by multiple members of a mob during attempts to force her to confess that her husband or another man was responsible for Taylor's assault. These crimes were known within the community, spoken of in hushed tones for decades, but it never occurred or appeared in an official report. Like so much of what happened in Rosewood, it was buried by silence and fear. By the end of the week, Rosewood was no longer a town. It was a smoldering landscape of ash and debris. Homes, businesses, schools, churches, all gone. Livestock killed or outright stolen. The land itself rendered uninhabitable through intimidation. Even after most residents had gone, the white groups would just return to burn whatever was still standing there, ensuring that no one would come back. One of the few buildings that was left intact belonged to a man named John Wright, a white store owner whose home stood near the edge of town. Wright had actually sheltered several Black women and children during the violence and later helped arrange their escape by train to Gainesville. His actions saved lives, but they were the exception, not the rule. For the most part, the mob acted with confidence that they would never be punished, and they were right. The official death toll listed only 8 victims, 6 Black residents and 2 white men. But the survivors consistently reject that number. Many believe that dozens were killed, their deaths unrecorded because no bodies were left in the woods. Many were burned in their homes. or they just never reported the deaths at all. In an era when Black lives were rarely documented and even more rarely investigated, it was easy to murder and disappear someone into the record as a rumor or an exaggeration. What could not be disputed was the scale of the displacement. Every Black family was driven out. Rosewood ceased to exist. And throughout the violence, law enforcement didn't intervene in any meaningful way. Deputies were present, but they didn't stop any attacks. No attempt was made to disband the mob or protect fleeing citizens. Instead, officials allowed the armed civilians to dictate the events. When the violence finally subsided, not because of justice, it's because there was nothing left to destroy. The state moved quickly to just straight up close the book. And in February of 1923, a grand jury would convene and examine what happened in Rosewood, and nearly 30 witnesses testified, most of them white. Black survivors were largely excluded or straight up too afraid to even speak. After hearing the testimony, the grand jury concluded there was insufficient evidence to bring charges to anyone involved. No arrests were made. No one was held accountable for the destruction of an entire town. For the survivors, the message was unmistakable. What happened to Rosewood was not an aberration. This is what it was designed to do. The mob had come looking for one man, and they left having destroyed an entire community. By the end of the week, Rosewood no longer existed in any meaningful sense. This quiet, self-sustaining Black town was reduced to ashes, rubble, and silence, and every Black family was gone. Many of them hid for days in the swamps and forests before daring to emerge. Those armed groups kept returning to Rosewood, and that's why everyone was so afraid. The destruction was so complete that Rosewood disappeared from maps and memory almost immediately. The roads leading into the town were left empty. Land that had belonged to Black families for generations was abandoned or absorbed by their neighbors. There was no rebuilding effort, no relief fund, no official acknowledgement that anyone had even been there in the first place. It wasn't treated as a crime scene, but just kind of like an inconvenience that had finally been dealt with. That last building left intact, the home of John Wright, had not been spared by chance, but because it belonged to a white man, and everything else was expendable. Even the fact that his primary customers were Black people, and they were essentially kind of destroying this man's business, they didn't think about that. For the Black families who escaped, though, survival came at an absolutely devastating cost. All of their home furniture, livestock, the deeds, their personal histories, they could never be recovered. So many people ran with nothing but the clothes they had on their backs. Some children were separated from their parents and reunited days later, but some never found their families. The survivors were scattered not just across Florida, in places like Gainesville, Jacksonville, Miami, or Tampa, but some of them actually ended up in other states. None of them returned to Levy County, believing correctly that it was no longer safe for them. And in the immediate aftermath, officials moved quickly to minimize everything. The newspapers began to describe things very vaguely, or they reframed it as regrettable but understandable due to Black criminality. The official death toll was set at 8, and they were not moving from it. They even put those in historical records, and it was repeated for decades. From the beginning, those who lived through the massacre insisted far more people had been harmed. They spoke about neighbors who had disappeared and they never saw them ever again, of the bodies that were left just to rot in the woods, of the homes that were burned with people still inside them. They described hearing gunshots at night and finding bloodstains days later. No corresponding names, no reports. Most of the survivors of Rosewood believe that dozens were killed. Others suspect that the number is even higher. What everyone agreed on was this: the official count could not possibly reflect the reality of what these people witnessed. Historians who later examined the massacre acknowledged that it was going to be very difficult to establish an accurate death count. Black deaths were often underreported in the early 20th century, but especially if it could be connected to the KKK. Many victims were never formally identified. Others very possibly could have been migrants or laborers whose disappearance went unnoticed because they weren't even from that community. The forced displacement of the Rosewood residents further complicated things because it forced witnesses all across the lower south of the US. And also, people were terrified. They did not feel safe reporting any of the things that they had seen to the authorities because while they were being attacked, the deputies of Levy County just watched them die. That lack of records, definitely not an accident. This is all deliberate inaction. They didn't want to actually document any casualties. They did not bring the coroner in. There was no inquest. No serious investigation followed this attack. The state of Florida attempted to immediately just quiet everything. And in February of 1923, that's when we had that grand jury, which was completely bogus. The few Black survivors who were actually willing to be a part of that grand jury were excluded. If they were still trying to speak to the grand jury, there was police intimidation as well. Most of them, however, were gone. And definitely the people who remained and tried to speak the truth understood the risks of contradicting the narrative from the state. The grand jury would hear testimony describing gunfire, burning buildings, murder, and the grand jury did acknowledge that violence occurred. Yet in their final conclusion, they said there was insufficient evidence to bring charges against an individual. No one was indicted. No arrests could be made. This was an entire town, thousands of people. The outcome wasn't unusual for the era. Across the South, white mobs routinely acted with impunity when targeting Black communities, and grand juries were frequently all white. Prosecutors were unwilling to challenge any popular sentiment. Law enforcement often participated in the violence. Justice, when it came to racial terror, was not blind, it was completely absent. And for the survivors of Rosewood, the grand jury's decision confirmed what they already knew. The state had no intention of protecting them, much less holding anyone accountable. The message was blunt. Your life, your property, and your suffering do not matter to us. In the years that followed, Rosewood was a ghost, spoken in whispers, if at all. Parents warned their children, don't tell anyone where we came from. Some families changed their last names. Others avoided Levi County together. The trauma was not only physical, but psychological. It was passed down through generations as silence and fear. They did not teach Rosewood in schools. It was no longer marked on any map. It was just a memory. And that erasure was the final act of violence. By destroying Rosewood and then refusing to acknowledge that it had ever existed, they ensured that the massacre would fade from public consciousness. There were no memorials, no apologies, no restitution. The land where Rosewood once stood was left to be reclaimed by nature, as if it had never existed at all. Yet the survivors remembered. They would remember the gunfire in the woods, the smell of smoke, the feeling of running barefoot through brush and water, carrying children too scared to cry. They remembered neighbors who never made it. And they remembered that when it was over, no one came to help. Rosewood was not destroyed in a single night. It was dismantled over days and then erased over decades by silence. And for a long time, that silence held. For nearly 60 years, the Rosewood Massacre existed in an enforced obscurity. It was rarely even mentioned in newspapers, definitely not taught in schools, and not acknowledged by state or local officials. Instead, it lived on in fragments, whispered stories shared among survivors, warnings passed quietly from parents to children, memories carried alone. Families who fled Rosewood scattered across Florida and beyond, building new lives while carrying the weight of everything they had lost. Most refused to speak of Rosewood at all, believing that silence was the only way to stay safe. In a region where racial violence had gone unpunished and unacknowledged, remembering also felt dangerous. That silence was not accidental. That's fear and trauma and a justice system that has made its position abundantly clear. And survivors knew what happened to people who challenged narratives in Jim Crow South. I mean, they had already seen an entire town destroyed. Speaking out really offered no protection, no restitution, and no guarantee of safety. So the safest thing was to say nothing and move on. Finally, though, the silence broke in 1982. Journalist Gary Moore of the St. Petersburg Times began investigating rumors he had heard about a destroyed black town in Levy County. What started as a curiosity quickly became something huge. He had tracked down elderly survivors and descendants, many of whom had never spoken publicly about Rosewood before this, and they were very hesitant. Some feared that there would be retaliation. Others doubted that anyone cared to listen about what had happened to them when they were children. But Moore persisted, gained their trust, and he interviewed each and every survivor, story by story. When the St. Petersburg Times published Moore's investigative series, it sent shockwaves through Florida and the rest of America. For the first time, Rosewood wasn't framed as a rumor or a legend, but it had been documented as historical atrocity. Survivors' voices appeared in print, describing the terror, the loss, and the decades of silence that followed. The article forced readers to confront a chapter of American history that had been deliberately buried. By the time Rosewood re entered the public conversation, a lot of the survivors were in their 80s and 90s. Some had spent their entire adult lives believing they would die without justice or acknowledgement. Yet when they were given the chance, they spoke anyway. They spoke out for themselves, but also for their neighbors and relatives who had been killed and could no longer speak at all. Their demands were not radical. They wanted the state of Florida to admit to what had happened and admit it to its failure to protect its own citizens. Public reaction was mixed. Some Floridians expressed outrage and disbelief, but others dismissed it. They said it was ancient history. Just leave the past in the past. Let it stay buried. But the survivors, the passage of time did not stop this pain. The destruction of Rosewood had shaped the rest of their lives economically, emotionally, psychologically. Their land had been stolen, their generational wealth completely erased. And the worst thing was the trauma that not only they had taken on, but that their descendants inherited. There is something called epigenetics, chemical changes on genes that alter how they are expressed, influencing stress response and through environmental factors like dysfunctional family patterns and behaviors, or say your family experiencing a horrific intergenerational trauma. And we have learned now, many decades later, that the trauma that the parent experiences, these are inherited epigenetic markers like DNA methylation. And it doesn't change your DNA, but it makes your offspring more vulnerable to things like anxiety, depression, or PTSD. So ultimately, going through something like Rosewood can be felt through generations, through their mental health. And that's not something we even knew about when they began unraveling the horrors of Rosewood. In 1993, survivors and descendants would formally petition the Florida legislature. They asked the state to acknowledge that the massacre had occurred, to recognize that law enforcement had failed to intervene, and to provide compensation for the losses that they suffered. This was bold. No United States state had ever paid reparations to any survivors of racial violence on this scale. The legislature responded by commissioning an official investigation, and that special committee reviewed historical records, newspaper accounts, survivor testimony, and law enforcement actions. The resulting report confirmed what survivors had been saying for decades. The massacre happened, the violence was racially motivated, and the state of Florida had failed to protect Rosewood citizens. The report also acknowledged that the justice system had failed to hold anyone accountable. The findings sparked intense debate. Supporters argued that reparations were not about assigning guilt to modern Floridians, but about acknowledging state responsibility and attempting, however imperfectly, to address a historic wrong. Because essentially, had those families been allowed to keep their homes and companies and businesses, we don't know how successful those people would have become in the next 60 years. But ultimately, you destroyed a family's attempt to secure generational safety, not necessarily wealth, but having land is a really big deal in this country. And ultimately, if you have land, you have an asset that you can pass along for generations. And that asset was stolen. On the opposite side, operators insisted the events were too distant in time or that compensation would open the door to endless claims. Some questioned survivor testimony despite the committee findings. But for survivors, the debate itself was painful. Once again, their suffering was being scrutinized, doubted, and weighed against political convenience. Many testified before lawmakers recounting these horrible memories they'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. They spoke of hiding in swamps, losing family members, and being forced to abandon everything they had ever owned. Their voices were steady, but the cost was visible. In 1994, after hearings and negotiation, Florida passed a reparations bill. The legislation awarded approximately 2.1 million to surviving families and victims, with the individual payments being up to around $150,000. They also established a scholarship fund for descendants of Rosewood. While the compensation could never restore what had been lost, the bill did represent something survivors had been denied for decades: acknowledgement. Florida became one of the only states in U.S. history to pay reparations for racial violence. The vote had not been unanimous. It was contentious and very emotional. But when it passed, survivors and descendants in the chamber openly wept, prayed, and embraced. For many, it was the first time the state had publicly affirmed that what happened to them was wrong. The reparations bill did not rebuild Rosewood. It couldn't return land or resurrect a community that had been destroyed. But it marked a rare moment of accountability in a country where racial terror had so often been met with denial. It also set a precedent, however limited, for confronting historical injustice through official acknowledgement. In the years that would follow, Rosewood gained a place, albeit a small one, in public memory. A Florida heritage landmark was resurrected near the site of the town, acknowledging the massacre and honoring its victims. The marker stands not as a restoration, but a reminder. There are no rebuilt homes, no restored churches, no bustling streets, just a sign, a clearing, and the knowledge of what once stood there. For survivors and descendants, the marker represents something complicated. It's a validation, but a reminder of how long that validation took. Many survivors would not live long enough to see it. Others lived long enough to hear the apology, but not enough to feel its impact, really. Even so, the acknowledgement mattered. Rosewood's story is not just about a massacre, it's about what happened afterward, about that silence, fear, and the deliberate erasure of suffering from historical record. It's about the courage required to break that silence decades later, when doing so means reopening wounds that haven't even healed. And it's about a rare moment when the state, however belated, chose to listen. The town of Rosebud was never rebuilt. The people never returned. But the story survived. And for the survivors of Rosewood, speaking out was never simply an act of just telling the truth. It was always a risk, even decades later. Most had spent their lives believing that silence was the only thing that had kept them alive. As children, they were warned to never even say the name outside of their family. And as adults, they learned to deflect questions, to avoid Levy County altogether, to bury memories that still surfaced in their nightmares. The massacre had taught a brutal lesson. Speaking out doesn't protect people's lives. Silence does. And that fear didn't disappear even in the 80s and 90s. When the journalists and the lawmakers started asking questions, people were scared. They were worried about retaliation. They were worried about being called liars. They were worried about reopening old wounds they had been trying desperately to close for decades. For many, speaking publicly about Rosewood meant reliving the worst days of their lives. Yet, when Gary Moore began tracking them down, something shifted. The survivors realized that if they didn't speak now, the truth would die with them. Many of the people Gary Moore spoke to were the last living witnesses. And yes, while silence had been a shield, that same silence had allowed Rosewood to disappear from history. Breaking that silence was painful but necessary. Had they not spoken, we wouldn't even have known that this ever happened. One of the biggest things that survivors spoke about was the economic toll. Without compensation or legal recourse, they had to start over with nothing. Opportunities that would have existed, education, business ownership, stability, all gone. It stole their future from them. Others also spoke about the psychological damage. The children who survived Rosewood grew up to carry deep anxiety, distrust of authority, inherited fear of white mobs and law enforcement. Some described being unable to sleep during thunderstorms because the sound reminded them of gunfire. Others said that they avoided the woods for the rest of their lives. There are wounds that no one had even acknowledged, let alone treated. Perhaps the hardest part of speaking out was confronting the disbelief. Even as the evidence mounted, readers questioned these survivors' memories, minimized their experiences, suggested that they were misremembering things from their childhood. For people who had already been silenced once by violence, that skepticism felt like a betrayal. But they kept talking. When they testified in front of the Florida legislature, it was heavy. Elderly men and women sat before those lawmakers and recounted stories that they had been told never to speak of. Some of them cried on the stand. Others spoke with quiet resolve. No one was asking for sympathy, just acknowledgement. And their courage changed that outcome. Now, of course, speaking out didn't erase the trauma. It couldn't restore what was lost. But for many survivors, it did offer something they had never been given, a chance to be heard on their own terms, to tell the story as they had lived it, to replace decades of silence with truth. And they did more than recount history. They reclaimed their place in history, breaking a silence that protected the lie. Rosewood forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about American history. Violence doesn't always announce itself as chaos. Sometimes it arrives dressed as justice. Sometimes it wears a badge. Sometimes it hides behind silence and paperwork and the phrase insufficient evidence. What happened in Rosewood was not a momentary lapse or an uncontrollable mob acting in isolation. This was the result of a system that allowed rumor to outweigh fact and fear to outweigh people's lives, destruction to go unanswered. For decades, the absence of accountability did as much damage as the violence itself, but history always has a way of resurfacing. And what broke that silence wasn't power or politics. It was just people. Elderly men and women who had spent their lives being told their stories don't matter. Survivors who understood if they did not speak, the truth would die with them. The reparations awarded decades later were not justice. They didn't return stolen land. They didn't resurrect the lost lives or build a town reduced to ash. But it did do something rare. It forced the state to acknowledge failure out loud, to admit that what happened in Rosewood was not a rumor, not exaggeration, not a tragedy without any blame, but it was a crime enabled by silence and indifference. It was a crime enabled by the state of Florida. And that acknowledgement matters. Rosewood is not just a story about a past. It's a warning about what happens when fear is allowed to override humanity and when justice is treated as optional. It asks us to consider whose pain gets recorded, whose suffering is to be believed. How many of these stories like this remain buried simply because no one has gone looking for it yet? Killers don't always get caught right away. Sometimes it takes decades. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been another episode of When Killers Get Caught. Because when violence is ignored, it becomes precedent. When survivors are silenced, lies become history. Rosewood teaches us that truth does not always surface quickly, but it does endure. It waits in memories, in records, in the voices of those who refuse to forget. 'Cause see the truth, it always leaves a trail, even when people try to burn it away.